Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is now officially time for my favorite part of the week, where I talk to a camera and talk to it and try to teach an imaginary audience. So, thank you again for joining me. If you are here, you should be here for our week 8 into American history too. Now, as you notice, hopefully on the syllabus, this week is going to be a bit of a best of times and worst of times scenario. Today, we're going to talk about when America was at among the best and brightest, at least economically, that it's ever been. Next time, we'll talk a little bit more about how America kind of went down the toilet for a bit. Anyway, today, as you can see from this title, we're going to look at what America was going through in the 1920s following World War I. As always, we'll start off with our key terms. A few things I want you to keep in mind. We're going to talk about the League of Nations today. We're going to talk about something called flappers. We're going to look at prohibition. We're going to look at the Scopes monkey trial. And we're going to look at something called the Harlem Renaissance. So keep that in mind. This is just a few examples of how America started to change during this time period, economically and culturally. It was a very exciting / strange time. Also, of course, keep your upcoming dates in mind. Your your next content quiz is coming up on October the 9th. It'll be due at 5 p.m., just like everything is. Your midterm writing assignment is coming up for a while from now. That'll be due on October the 23rd at 5 p.m. As I've mentioned before, your prompt and rubric are already located in Moodle. Please make sure you go and check that over to make sure you're as prepared for the assignment as possible, especially to make sure that you realize that I did change the word count for that assignment. Make sure you're only doing what is appropriate. Don't go too over, and definitely don't go too far under. Also, our next debate will be on October the 30th at 5 p.m. There's another alternate assignment already on Moodle, of course. The prompt and the rubric are already located in Moodle as well. This next part is actually outdated, as you should have seen from my emails. I have already shared a sign-up list for possible debate times. Please should make sure you fill that out as soon as possible so we can actually try to have an official debate this time. I personally think that would be a lot more interesting than doing some sort of just alternate assignment and submitting a presentation. Make sure you fill that out as soon as you possibly can. In the meantime, we're going to jump right into it to looking at some of the international problems that faced America and, by extension, a little bit, the outside world. First off, as many of you may already be aware, Wilson became internationally famous at the end of World War I by proposing the 14 points in a speech he gave to Congress as part of his, which would also be part of his negotiations at the Treaty of Versailles. In these 14 points, he essentially laid out 14 points that he believed would lead to world peace and international cooperation. In one of the readings for this week, I would like for you, of course, to go over the full 14 points, but just for now, for the interest of time, we're going to look over 3 of them specifically. A couple of things he wanted to focus on. 1. Wilson argued for the creation of new nations in Central Europe. Essentially, smaller ethnicities or ethnic groups living in some of the big European nations would now be given countries of their own. He also argued for free and open trade between all nations. No restrictions, no banning trade with any nations, everyone gets to trade. Finally, he also argued for the start of open agreements and open negotiations between nations. No more secret negotiations or diplomacy would be conducted. Now, why do you think he would want to popularize all of these following World War I? Audience that I'm going to go ahead and give an awkward pause for. Yeah, see, the papers even called him the man of the hour. He was a bit of a popular guy at the time. Now, let's start with the ones that are probably the most simple. Free trade seems pretty straightforward. A lot of times, as we talked about throughout this class, and you've probably talked about in other history classes, a lot of times people go to war over trade or access to resources. Theoretically, if we allow open trade between everybody, there's no need to go to war over resources anymore because everyone's going to be trading openly. We'll all have access to everything we need. The third is perhaps most directly to the causes of World War I. If you remember from last week, one of the major causes of World War I was all the diplomacies and alliances that had secretly been formed between the various imperial nations. The idea with this is that if there were no more secret alliances being formed, you were less likely to have a big world war again. Obviously, that didn't work out. We'll talk a little bit about that next week. Now, the imperialism issue relates a little bit to this first part of the 14 points, the creation of the new nations in Central Europe. Essentially, he's trying to break up some of these large imperial nations. Why might that make the world less likely to go to war, do you think? Yeah, an awkward pause. I don't during the pause. I don't know if I should look at the camera, if I should stare off into the distance and look sophisticated. It's at least as awkward for you as it is for me. I mean, as for me as it is for you. There we go. Another example of awkwardness. But yeah. In the meantime, you might have figured it out a little bit. Like we talked about last week, fighting over these imperial holdings was a big part of World War I. The idea is that if you break up some of these empires and give some people more freedom, you're going to have less conflict. There will be less imperial power and resources to fight over, and other people, for example, the ones who assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand, won't feel the need to fight and rebel against the imperial powers anymore. So essentially, you break up some of these empires, there's not as much to fight over. However, unfortunately for Wilson, and possibly by extension the rest of the world, the Senate, when they were given the vote, voted to not join the League of Nations. Why do you think they voted that way? Think about how America behaved early in World War I. Yes, very good, imaginary class. This again calls back to America's isolationism. Instead of World War I inspiring America to get more involved in international affairs, once America saw how brutal the war could be, this actually made them even less likely to want to get involved in international affairs. So essentially, America wanted to ignore Wilson's international cooperation ideas and just stay isolated again. This, of course, limited the power of the League of Nations, because by this point, America had already become a great industrial and military power, so it was pretty obvious that without America's support, the League of Nations would not be as effective. Because remember, how exactly are you going to force all these international communities to get along? You can't just go out there and kill them, because they're not going to join the League of Nations, even if they all live. So essentially, leaving these people, America, out of it is going to make it much harder for people to cooperate. Now, other thing I want to focus on just very briefly is the First Red Scare. If you remember from last week, in the final years of World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in Russia, so now for the first time there was an official communist government in the world. This led to the first Red Scare in American history. One of the major characteristics of this Red Scare was the Palmer Raids, as they were called. These were led by Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer. A couple of characteristics of what he did. He was known to search homes without warrants, he would go through and read people's private mail, and he would frequently monitor and survey or have surveillance on quote-unquote suspicious individuals. Now, especially for those of you who maybe lean a little bit more towards libertarian beliefs, but even just anyone in this class who really likes the Constitution, why are these such a big problem? Yes, very good, imaginary class. For those of you who are familiar with the Constitution, these violate several of the amendments of the Constitution. For example, you're not allowed to search homes without warrants, you're violating the right to privacy, and constantly monitoring people. This is seen as by many people still today as a major breach of privacy. Now, something to keep us thinking about how this still impacts us today and later throughout history. Are decisions like these ever justified? For those of you who remember, I know some of you might be a little bit young, but some of you might remember the start of NSA and Homeland Security after the 9/11 attacks. Many people argued that Muslim communities should be surveyed in a very similar way to the Palmer raids. So this is not the only time that anything like this has happened. Many times in turbulent points in American history, some people start arguing that we should give up a few of our freedoms in order to increase security. So keep that in mind as we go throughout other examples of things like the Red Scare and other instances of fear and paranoia. Are actions like these ever justified? That's something you guys will have to help decide as you vote and or get involved in future governments. In the meantime, Americans, why were they so scared of communism? This should bring us back a little bit to the Gilded Age. Why would communism scare some of these businessmen and individuals in America? Again, after the awkward pause, very good job, imaginary class. America, of course, is scared of communism because it's considered to be the antithesis of capitalism. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago, capitalism was on the uprise and very popular still throughout America. Many people believe communism, as you can see here in this picture, would come in and destroy all of the freedom and wonder that America had always represented. Keep this in mind as well. Think about why Americans are so scared of communism and how that fear is going to play out throughout the rest of the class. In the meantime, we'll look at the Roaring Twenties and the Woman. Interesting title, I know, but I do want to look a little bit at how gender relations and the behavior of women also was seen to change throughout the 1920s. Throughout the 1920s, there were many examples of where women would rebel against the Victorian ideals of their parents and their ancestors. These women typically dressed, as you can see here, very short, stylish haircuts, nice dresses, things of that nature, openly drinking alcohol, for example, as you can see here, which would have been very scandalous at the time. They became known as flappers. Still very popular today, for example. Just to give you a personal example, no, before you ask, I am not a flapper, but my mom's office last Halloween, she's a CPA, had a flapper party for their Halloween party. So flappers are still a pretty iconic part of American culture, you could argue. Now, what do you think some of the Victorian ideals are for women exactly, and how are these women rebelling against them? Awkward pause once again. Yeah, I already mentioned a few of them, as you could probably guess if you're paying attention. The dress is a big part of it. Women are starting to show off even just a little bit more skin. Still not like today, obviously, but very different than the whole dress up to your neck or your chin, covering all the way down to your ankles, arms completely covered. Women are starting to be a little more open and stylish in their dress. The short hairstyle, of course, is a part of it as well, and especially the public drinking and other quote-unquote sort of lewd behavior. This is something women never did in public before, and is one of the first times we saw it in American history. Now, something I need you to be prepared for, especially in the next couple of slides and for upcoming assignments. Make sure you go over all the readings I assigned for flappers this week. Make sure you're prepared to discuss how flappers did specifically rebel against Victorian ideals. I'm just going to talk about a few of them for this recording. For example, I do want to spend a moment looking at Margaret Sanger and the document reading you had this week on her seeking pity for teenage mothers and abstinent couples. Be prepared to look at several things. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to answer all these questions directly in any assignment, but you should go through these to be prepared for future assignments. Now, as you can guess, essentially in this document, to give you just a brief overview, Margaret Sanger is attempting to push people to have access to birth control to help out with some of these teenage mothers and abstinent couples. That's a little bit of background. Now, to get you a little bit specific, throughout the 1920s, she was a very active role model in pushing to educate women about family planning, access to birth control, things of that nature, medical supply access, anything they would need. Now, be prepared to get more in detail in future assignments with these few things. What were some of Margaret Sanger's main goals? Why did she believe these goals were so necessary and important for women in America as well? She wasn't just doing this for the heck of it. She believed this would benefit women somehow. Also, what were some of the specific health problems faced by mothers and abstinent couples during this time? What were the financial problems they underwent? What were some of the specific problems for older couples? And finally, just again to give this a little bit of modern context perhaps and to show its relevance, how are we going to deal with problems like this and how should we deal with this debate today? Has this debate on how to deal with teenage mothers, deal with pregnancies, deal with abstinent couples, things of that nature, how do we deal with that debate today? It's nothing, these problems we deal with today are really nothing new. In the meantime, I will tell you a little bit, of course, about the impact of Margaret Sanger's campaigning. She was actually fairly successful. She was, of course, very popular with this birth control review, which she would edit, which helped to popularize some of her ideals. This picture right here, for example, should give you a bit of an idea of what some of her overarching goals were. Why was she trying to control pregnancy or help women with pregnancies based on this photo right here, or this drawing right here? A couple of her long-standing impacts. She was responsible for the creation of the American Birth Control League, which was founded in 1921. These were some examples of some pamphlets they would pass out. Eventually, by 1942, this group changed its name to Planned Parenthood Federation of America, which again might give you a bit of an idea of the current controversy and long-lasting impact of Margaret Sanger's work. Now, be prepared to discuss later in the class, why exactly is Planned Parenthood so controversial? And just to make sure we take the argument both sides, no matter where your political stances are, think about as well what might be some of the positives associated with Planned Parenthood's existence. Again, whether you agree with Margaret Sanger's policies or not, she didn't create this to just necessarily destroy people's lives deliberately. She had arguably good intentions in mind. Finally, again, what are some of the possible negatives? What kind of potential negatives might Planned Parenthood have had upon American society? Again, be prepared to discuss both and look at both sides. But if you're a Democrat and love things like birth control reviews and Planned Parenthood, consider the other side a little bit. If you think all of this is the worst thing in the world, be prepared to discuss the other side as well. I don't want you to just have one-sided views on this. Make sure you look at both. In the meantime, we'll discuss the second reading just very briefly as well. Young Women Discuss Petting. This one is one of the more interesting documents because it talks about petting parties that became popular during the 1920s. The reason I say it's interesting is probably not for the reason you might think at first glance. And most people, when they would look at things like petting, to give you a bit of an idea again of this, what this document's about, they would see it as just a huge sexual rebellion where women were going out and essentially doing whatever they wanted. However, if you go through this document and look at what petting parties actually are, you see that it's a little bit more complicated than that. Even during this time, women aren't just completely throwing away every single ideal they learned from their Victorian mothers. This is again a great example, kind of like Planned Parenthood. Look a little bit more in detail and analyze things. Everything's not so necessarily cut and dry. But when you read this document, again, for future assignments, be prepared to discuss the following. What exactly is petting? Why did girls feel the need to participate in petting, or why did they want to? Why did some people refer to girls as a flat tire during this time period involved with petting parties? And lastly, what kind of views did most women have on premarital sex in the 1920s? Like I said earlier, it's not necessarily just as cut and dry as you would think. And once you've ever answered that, think about whether this changes your opinion on how rebellious these girls were being. Are they completely throwing off all of their Victorian beliefs? Keep that stuff in mind as you go through this. In the meantime, let's look at legal conflicts as well. One of the more interesting aspects of the 1920s, in my humble opinion. Now, as some of you know, as some of you remember from last time, we talked a little bit about prohibition and temperance movements. By January 19th, 1919, Congress had passed the 18th Amendment, also known as the Prohibition Amendment. So remember, what was prohibition? And who wanted it the most? Alright, again, very good imaginary class. Prohibition was, of course, the attempt to outlaw the sale and consumption of alcohol. As I mentioned last week, many women were heavily involved in temperance and prohibition movements because they were seen as the ones who primarily suffered at the hands of drunk husbands and drunk fathers. So again, this is when women started to get much more politically active. Now, a couple of interesting effects of prohibition. As you might imagine, it didn't exactly go the way they would want. For example, we actually owe a lot of these old gangster movies to prohibition. Many gangsters and organized crime organizations in America got their start by bootlegging and selling illegal alcohol. For example, Al Capone, one of the most famous gangsters of all time, initially got his start bootlegging and running alcohol from places like Chicago and New York. This is also when the Thompson submachine gun became popularized in America. If you played World War I era video games, for example, you would know how much of an innovation that was. Car mass production also jumped during this time period as well, again, possibly because of prohibition. We jumped from 8 to 23 million being produced every year by the 1920s. Now, also connecting this to NASCAR a little bit, why would all these cars being produced during this time, and why does NASCAR potentially owe its existence to prohibition and bootlegging? If I have any NASCAR fans in here, you should probably know this. Or any bootleggers, maybe. I don't know what you guys do with your private lives. But yes, again, very good. A class that's hopefully watching this at home days after I'm recording this. Cars, of course, were the primary vehicle used for prohibition or for prohibition-era bootlegging. You can't exactly necessarily use official trains, of course, so you use these newly invented cars. NASCAR also arguably owes itself to prohibition because many of the racers in the early stock car races got their start with these bootlegging cars. Naturally, you want to make your car as effective and tricked out as possible. if that's still a term that kids use, so it can more effectively get away from the authorities. That eventually led to some of these races being organized officially. Boom. Decades later, you eventually get NASCAR. So again, think about also how prohibition still affects us today. Some of you might even live near dry counties still, for example. The legacy of prohibition is still with us. For instance, in my hometown, liquor by the drink, which essentially allows regular restaurants to sell hard liquor, only passed a few years ago. Some people still believe in ideas like prohibition and temperance. It's not going away anytime soon. Also, I do want to look at religious debates as well, and specifically how that played out in education. In the 1920s, there started to be a more passionate debate between fundamentalists and Darwinists in America's educational system. Fundamentalists were a Christian group, naturally, that believed you should teach literal interpretations of the Bible. This specifically referred to anything involving science, especially. Teaching against things like evolution, the Big Bang, or essentially any other scientific teaching that was seen to go against a literal interpretation of the Bible. Darwinists, of course, followed the whole survival of the fittest ideas of Darwinism and believed in teaching evolution and eventually things like the Big Bang. This eventually led to the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. In this instance, a teacher named John T. Scopes accepted an offer from the American Civil Liberties Union to violate the law on purpose. Now, why on earth do you think they would do that? Hopefully you're puzzling on this at home. I kind of like to think of this as I'm like teaching through time. I recorded this on Saturday and you might be watching this on a Wednesday puzzling through it. But anyway, as you might guess, this is what a lot of lobbyist groups do throughout America. They essentially are getting him to break the law on purpose so they can bring it to trial. If they're able to win the case, that can lead to evolution openly being taught across America. So again, it's essentially sort of a civil disobedience idea that a lot of protest groups or political organizations have done throughout American history. However, he was found guilty and fined $100. Why is that maybe significant? Alright, it could show essentially the ineffectiveness of the trial. The trial didn't really accomplish much. He was found guilty, but he was only given a very small fine that the Civil Liberties Union paid anyway. And actually, the ultimate fate of the trial when it was appealed was the judge essentially, to cut out all the legal jargon, just said, you know what, let's just drop this case, we're done with it, we're not changing any rulings. So essentially the case barely came to anything. However, it does reveal how deeply divided many people could still be and how passionate they were about this issue. As you can see in this photograph, the town that this trial was occurring in essentially became a tourist spot and a media circus. People were selling and buying all sorts of books and memorabilia from both sides, and people were flocking to the town to see the evidence of the trial. The national press also showed how deeply divided and angry people could be about this issue. There were various newspaper posts which claimed that people were hot for Genesis, attacking the fundamentalists. It called some of the people in this town yokels, morons, and other sort of dumb, hateful, stereotypical words. So again, very hotly debated issue, as you might imagine. Last thing we'll look at for the 1920s is the state of African Americans throughout the 1920s. In the 1920s, there was actually a great rise of violence against African Americans throughout the area. Think about why this might have been the case. Look at essentially everything we've talked about regarding African Americans in this class. Alright, very good. Again, class is hopefully viewing this in the future. In the 1920s, remember, this is just after fusion politics has been torn apart, free African Americans are still emerging in society, so violence actually increased against them to try to prevent anything like quote-unquote Negro rule or equality actually happening. Because of this, the Great Migration occurred, which is where many Southern African Americans migrated to northern cities. Between 1920 and 1930, 8% of the southern black population had actually migrated up into the northern states. This helped lead to something called the Harlem Renaissance, which was a rise in popularity of African American jazz musicians. Now, how might this benefit but also limit the progress of African American society? Again, imaginary pause. But yes, very good again, future class. This would, of course, benefit African Americans by allowing some of them to become more prosperous and also to become more accepted in mainstream culture. However, it was still seen somewhat as a limitation because despite it revealed essentially the hypocrisy. Despite the fact that many of these musicians were now widely popular, they were still under the same segregation rules as the rest of the African American community. A further limitation can be seen when W.E.B. Du Bois, who you can see here, and the NAACP tried to help or successfully help pass the first anti-lynching bill in the House of Representatives. However, this bill did ultimately fail in the Senate, which again shows that the American government as a whole really wasn't committed to the safety of African Americans. Now, that's where I'm going to leave you today. Make sure you go through this pretty carefully and you're prepared for next week, where we'll talk about the Great Depression. Of course, keep all these upcoming dates in mind. Make sure if you have any questions, you run them by me as soon as possible. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week.